talking to Shannon Winnubst about her book, Way Too Cool, Selling Out Race and Ethics. And I thought maybe we could begin by discussing when and where you decided to center on this idea of cool and how it was you went about in an academic way of studying this object, this fairly difficult to define and pinpoint notion of being cool and selling cool. So, yeah, where did this come from?
That's a good question. That's a good methodological question, as we like to call it in WGSS. Cool didn't really become the overarching trope for the book and for the way I was trying to sort out the questions of neoliberalism until I gotten pretty far down the road in terms of thinking through what is, for me, at the core of it, which is the Lacanian take on Foucault's lectures on neoliberalism. So for a long time, maybe 2 years, I was actually really, really trying to work through apathy and trying to think about the apathetic as this mode that, right, we hear a lot about. I mean, I think it's in some ways a generational divide that often crops up. But this notion that at least Generation X and perhaps not millennials are somehow apathetic, I think was part of the cultural rooting for it. But it had that sense of transcendence and detachment that I was interested in. And then thankfully it was through colleagues at a panel where I was presenting a paper, and I had a couple of excellent respondents, Falguni Sheth and Shannon Sullivan. And it was Falguni really who said, I'm not buying it. I'm not buying the apathy thing. And she gave me a hard argument against it. And so I went back to the drawing board. So then there you are, and you're kind of lost. And then it hit me when I really started working on cathexis. And once I got to the cathexis, that cathexis really was a centerpiece of the book, then cool opened up. And the way it opened up was sort of, remarkable, because it had all these resonances around what's happening with history, and particularly what's happening with history related to anti-racism and to Black culture. That spoke to everything I was trying to do. So it was kind of a strangely magical moment in doing research when I hit on this concept, and it suddenly changed everything in such a good way. Sometimes those moments are not so fruitful.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that appealed to me with this, is the idea that you're taking something really ephemeral and something that's hard to understand and especially hard to pinpoint, and you're using it to speak about something that is also hard to pinpoint, neoliberalism. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about how you grounded this work. One thing that I found really interesting is that you have these little snapshots of cool throughout the book of images. We have the Snoopy character, Joe Cool. You have Miles Davis in there, and a number of other, examples of cool. But how do you stay grounded when you're dealing with these two really sort of ephemeral, intangible concepts, neoliberalism and cool?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and I hope that I did stay grounded enough. It's the core of the project really was about neoliberalism. It really was about and about trying to really get into what this thing is that we keep calling neoliberalism, that I think a lot of academics think is no longer, that we've sorted it out, right? That it's a dead object, and that we've mastered that one, which is always something to be suspicious of. But as I really got into that, what happened was I just started feeling so frustrated with this, what I called in the book, and I would stand by, a kind of overarching Marxist reading that just reduces it to a political economic problem. And it's so clear to me it's not, that it really has a cultural root. And that's why Foucault's lectures and the way he talks about it as a social rationality became a really strong through line for me. So that was the core. And then again, as cool opened up as a way to articulate in a more, for me, more grounded manner, how that social rationality has begun to shape, and I hesitate to say warp, but it has begun to shape even the very affects that we have in culture now towards things, hence the title, right? We've become, not only have we become cool, but we've become sort of way too cool. Then they started to speak to each other, and they started to kind of walk together in some ways. So you had the work on neoliberalism and trying to think about it more psychosomatically, as it were, culturally, but then cool was doing that work. And I knew already through Bell Hooks and through all of her work on cool that there was a long history there, and that there was a history of Black resistance. And so knowing that then gave me really a way to historically ground it. And so the snapshots are doing a couple of things, right? I mean, on the one hand, I think when you get really enmeshed in a psychoanalytic view, so the Lacanian part of the book is you really start to want to read in a way that isn't just linear, because I was really trying to write a book that would move us, that wouldn't just speak to our heads. Mm-hmm. And so the interludes are an attempt to get at that, some of those sort of less rational ways of doing that. And then they're also doing some historical work, because they obviously speak to different historical periods. So my hope was that people would read them not just linear. They function sort of like epigraphs to each chapter. But I also kind of hope that especially students, that they'll flip through and say, well, that's an interesting figure. Let's read the chapter on that.
Yeah, well, and I found that really interesting in the sense that it sort of breaks up the book, but it also ties it together. And so they are, I think they're really effective, even just these small sort of, if anyone hasn't read it yet, it's like 2 pages of just explaining a little moment in time, from John Lennon's Instant Karma to certain artworks and stuff like that. And I wanted to go back to the idea of being Marxist, but not just Marxist, because it's also something that I've been really interested in, is Foucault going beyond what I guess more traditional Marxists might do in a reading. And you mentioned a few times that Foucault is adamant that neoliberalism and what's going on is not merely ideological or ideology. Why is that such an important element to your argument?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It is important. I mean, part of it, I think the core, how to say this, it's sort of twofold. On the one hand, I think we often have a kind of flat-footed notion of ideology, especially in the United States, where we say, if you say it's ideological, that's a way of saying, so we don't need to talk about it anymore. It shuts down conversations in a cultural manner. But also, clearly, the more academic and sense of it as coming out of a kind of understanding of politics and economies as interacting in particular structural manners. And I think that's what we're seeing with neoliberalism, and that's what Foucault opens to, is to say these aren't just structural political economic kinds of phenomenon. There's also other things happening here, whether we call it, social or however we might talk about it. So that was one aspect of it. Another aspect of it, which you're aware of, is that the figure in particular that became so important was Althusser. And that's driven by the Lacanian analysis, which is to say that if, part of the way ideology should function is that there's some kind of coherent, what Lacan would call a coherent symbolic, but what we might also just call a cohesive univocal authority. And that's where particularly the work of Slavoj Žižek is clear on this, but also Jody Dean's work is very clear, both of their work on neoliberalism, to say we don't really have that functioning in this culture any longer. And I think we can see that now pretty clearly. You've got Facebook that's going to run an election in the most recent example here, speaking in early November 2017. But social media shows this. I'm guessing, the field of communications is all over this, I think. That authority just does not function in ideological manners any longer in these kind of cohesive RSAs and ISAs that Althusser mapped out. And so if we're going to think through neoliberalism as Foucault opens it, then we have to think about authority and cultural kinds of phenomenon no longer in structural ideological manners.
And so if you could just say a little bit more. We have this idea, we have Althusser's ideas of repressive state apparatus and ideological state apparatus, and he definitely focuses on an earlier time where the church and the police and the family and the school were very, not perfectly clear, but definitely more cohesive. What happened today, I guess, like within our neoliberal society, that makes that no longer a viable way to approach the issue?
Well, I mean, I'm a parent of a 9-year-old, so the school is a very easy place to see neoliberalism at its ultimate, where there is no one school, right? We live in this cozy little neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio. The kids all go to different schools because there's so much of this school choice. Mm-hmm. So there is no cohesive schoolmaster. There is no cohesive one education that's happening, even at an everyday kind of banal level any longer. And so I think what you see is historically, and there's all kinds of ways to account for this, right? And this is something I think we're all still very much in the grips of, but neoliberalism is one overarching, it seems to me, way of getting at some of it, whereby if you take Foucault's lectures, and if you take basic benchmarks of the elections of Thatcher and Reagan in the UK and the US respectively in 1980, across the 70s and then certainly into the 80s, these kinds of structures, and I would hold out the police as a kind of exception to this, but certainly the church, the schools, and the family, where the divorce rate's soaring, and then heaven forbid you have untraditional kinds of families, be they racialized or sexualized, are all coming apart, to put it in the terms of nostalgia. Or you might say they're all opening up, to put them in a more kind of celebratory way. And so historically in the US, at least, especially, you can see that that's happening. So I don't know if that answers the kind of question or the register you're wanting to talk in.
Yeah, no, I mean, the argument that Althusser is no longer the place to go or the place to stop. I guess it's a place to begin, but not to end in terms of analyzing what's going on, I think was really compelling in your book. And I'm wondering, just for people who, I don't know if this even exists anymore, but people who are Althusserian, down and to the heart, Althusserian, what would you say to them that they need to encompass that he doesn't give us anymore?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've been told, by the way, that Althusserians are dead, so whatever that means. But I appreciate that. I like the question. For me, some of the most intriguing, I had not read extensively in Althusser before I got obsessed with him through this project. And some of the interesting findings I had there was how incredibly informed by Lacan he is. Mm-hmm. And so that's in part the move, right? To say, well, what if you broaden Althusser out to some of the ways we've read him vis-a-vis Marx, and we begin to read him vis-a-vis psychoanalysis? Well, then you have a very different kind of way of talking about things like the unconscious or the social body as not always falling into these structuralist manners. And then there's a way of saying, okay, so certainly because it doesn't make any sense. And I think maybe this is what you're getting at in terms of the ephemeral, right?
Yeah. I mean, especially with the idea of neoliberalism not being coherent, right? Precisely.
And this also gets to why I want to hold the police out, and I do in the book hold the carceral state out as an exception, because there are places in neoliberal cultures, plural, where Althusser can still, an Althusserian analysis can still make all kinds of inroads. So I want to be clear, and I hope I was in the book, that it's not to say, wow, Althusser, rest in peace. It is more to say, and it was particularly, I want to make this clear also, coming out of my work in queer theory, because what was most disturbing was when I go back to early queer theory, particularly Judith Butler's work, but also queer of color work, so particularly Jose Munoz's work, and see how deeply Althusserian they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and you definitely make it clear, I think.
Yeah, so if you see the roots so even queer theory, which should be one of these places that we want to say, well, here's something that's opening up new ways of theorizing, still very Althusserian.
Well, a key aspect of your book is race. And I was interested in the idea, and your project is about race and ethics, as it says in the subtitle here. But I'm wondering what makes race one of the keys to understanding this whole situation. I mean, you lay it out in your book, but I'd like you to talk a little bit about what makes race central to this discussion.
Yeah, well, my thinking on this has moved a lot. So that's the ending of the book, and I've taught, it's an ambitious and kind of perhaps overly ambitious book insofar as the ending, where I really make the argument that we need to read race as the real, the Lacanian real, and thereby get into a question of ethics. That's now where I'm continuing to try to think. I think there's much, much, much more work to be done on that project. And so the argument that I give in the book is a great deal to do with how gender, particularly, is the other category that I work on the most, seems to me increasingly not to be able to open onto really ethical problems. Gender, what I want to say there is gender as it's used particularly in cisgender contexts, which is the dominant mainstream way of understanding it. So there's a caveat there about transgender. And so in the failure of that, then I turn to race, which is where I was always already, which is why cool was the trope to take as the thing that, as I said in the book, jams the neoliberal machine. And so what I mean by that is that you take innumerable examples, right? Since the book has been published, those examples, unfortunately, are coming faster and more furiously. The one that comes in the book most is Hurricane Katrina. Another one that could have, and that I had a colleague, Andrew Diltz, raise to me early on, is the Flint, Michigan water crisis.
Yeah.
Both examples where you have predominantly Black communities who get into human-made environmental disasters and for whom the state and the general population doesn't care. And so has become way too cool in that unethical way of becoming callous. And so those are indicators that race, and what I would say now, I would sharpen it now to say that it really is anti-Blackness. So there's more to say there, but that anti-Black forms of racism, which is, I think, the core of racism, has consistently been this blockage to the neoliberal social rationality of turning everything into a nice fungible good that we can think is cool and hip and, try it on today and do something else tomorrow. So anti-Black racism cannot, to put it in these terms, cannot feed in to the machine of neoliberal diversity. And so perhaps that's helpful enough, or you can push me along further.
Yeah, well, why can't it? Why? I mean, what is it that makes race different than a lot of other things that people will say? Like neoliberalism seems to be this sort of all-consuming. I almost picture like a dark cloud or a brightly colored, glamorous cloud, or whatever, however it's dressed up. But this kind of ephemeral cloud that seems to be coming over the horizon and taking in everything and absorbing everything that it comes into contact with. And as you say in the book, right, race doesn't work exactly like that. So what is it about race that makes it so difficult for neoliberalism to simply absorb?
Well, there's the big question, isn't it? What I would say now is that it's a 500-year-old structure of phobic attachment and a kind of violence that classical liberalism has never digested. And so it is that in the way that I talk about in the book about the various fantasies of liberalism and neoliberalism, there are certain kernels that are indigestible. And because I would now frame it as this kind of founding gesture of violence that we see founding modernity itself, it certainly never was getting taken up fully into liberalism. And so there's no way that it's going to get taken up into neoliberalism. That's one way of putting it. Another way of putting it is every other social difference, right? And so I do think it's the dressed up, glamorous rainbow cloud, because every other social difference, and this is really one of the core readings of neoliberalism in the book, can be cool. In other words, there's an aestheticizing of social differences that is critical and is always moving neoliberalism along as this kind of circuit of the drive that we don't need to have any deep, dark desire fulfilled. We just need to have endless stimulation by more cool stuff. And so the whole phrase, right, as a white person to say, well, I have a couple of black friends or I listen to this or that music. And so I must be cool. They're all taken on as accoutrement. Mm-hmm. I think there is a way in which if you read somebody like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, if you have any kind of consciousness about the realities of the carceral state in the United States, then you know that there's all kinds of racialized bodies who are not cool and who are just being warehoused for death, really.
Yeah, well, I think that the book comes actually maybe even a little bit before this sort of peak in our discourse with the 2016 election in the U.S. and changes in terms of how race is being represented and this dichotomy sort of between the left and the right. But I did notice that a few times in the book, you basically write that Black Lives Matter had just started. As you were finishing this book, you included it for a few sentences, basically, because I think you were doing proofs at the time. And but you do write in the middle, on page 74 for me, that the potential of this movement, Black Lives Matter, is astounding. So I cannot possibly anticipate how it might unfold beyond December 2014 when you were writing. And so, I mean, it is beyond that now. And so I'm curious of what you think has transpired and how it relates to your expectations or your ideas in December of 2014. Because obviously a lot has happened since.
It has, and that's just sort of the deeply sad part of the moment. So it's a really sad question you're asking for me, but I really appreciate it. I think that there is much to say. I would come at it this way. First of all, when you begin to see through the election of Donald Trump to the presidency in the United States and the unleashing of white supremacists physically and discursively into the American public sphere, I would still read that in the way I read race in the book. And so the basic reading there, it's difficult to encapsulate in all its complexity because it's a Lacanian argument. But the basic argument that the real, which is the thing we can't speak, so it erupts, the real erupts in usually violent and sometimes pleasurable ways. And what I'm seeing now is that we are constantly, we're now seeing much more regular eruption of that real. And yet we can't quite figure out as a culture meaningful, and by meaningful, I mean ways of speaking that hold traction, or to just put it bluntly, ways of speaking that cathect us, in order to capture what this kind of really violent white supremacist action and such means, particularly because we can see, and people will disagree with this ideologically, of course, but we can see that it is, in fact, held up by people who are in quite powerful positions in the government.
Well, the occasion? Well, the occasion for the Black Lives Matter movement, right after the death of Trayvon Martin and the acquittal of Zimmerman, and really early, not by any means the first, but early indications that there was a racialized, brutalizing police presence, not by any means all police, but there were certain officers who were definitely in the wrong and who are now being videotaped. And so Black Lives Matter began as a response to these kinds of videos being presented and the kinds of stand your ground defenses that were being used in order to effectively kill young black men in certain high profile cases like the Trayvon Martin. This was just at the beginning when you were writing this moment, although of course, it dates back to a long history of race in America. Has it progressed in a way since it began, or since you were writing in December 2014? Has it progressed in a way that makes sense to you, I guess, in your reading of this, or has it gone in a different direction than you would have predicted in that time?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I mean, neither, because, so the problem, as I can put it this way, is that what I was holding out hope for, right, is that the Black Lives Matter movement seems, and it still seems this way to me, and I'm still very hopeful about it, as this remarkably different kind of movement that is not going to be so easily co-opted, to use some of our most habitual language, by the state or by the market. And I think it has continued to resist both of those things. Unfortunately, we have now unleashed a kind of stronger state-backed racist policies that are cracking down directly on Black Lives Matter activists. So they're being surveilled and policed and incarcerated at higher rates. And secondly, we have a media that no longer seems to be paying attention to anti-Black and racist policing. And so the example there is what's happening right now as we're talking in St. Louis in 2017, the fall of 2017, where there have been 2 months now of demonstrations against the St. Louis police vis-a-vis a verdict of innocence against a police officer who shot a black man, a young black man, from 6 inches away from his head, as I understand. I think it was back in 2013. The verdict came down this fall. There have been 2 months of protests there, Black Lives Matter kinds of protests, extraordinarily multiracial and sustained. And we haven't heard about it in the mainstream media at all. And so there is a way in which I fear that the numbing to racism is happening through these spectacles of Charleston, or spectacles of white supremacy as neo-Nazis, right? That's what we're seeing now in the media. And so then you get a huge swath of the white population saying, well, that's not us, right? That was the chant at a lot of rallies after Charleston. This is not us. And I would disagree with that. I would say, no, that actually is us. And until we're able to speak about this racism as something that's coming out of us, and here I'm speaking particularly as a white person, but out of our culture more broadly, then we don't have a chance of really trying to handle what this persistent racism is.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that, I think, relates to the argument about neoliberalism being about people who have interests and who are basically their interests, right? Like their individual choices that they make and that they choose to buy or not buy certain products seems to make us who we are in this neoliberal society. And in that sense, if I'm not out protesting as a Nazi or something, then I can easily say I have made no racist choices. I am not a racist. And I think definitely this is something that we see a lot of from probably many well-intentioned white people who are not Nazis. And so they think that I have not made any choices to purchase white supremacist materials or to condone that kind of thing. And therefore, what else can I do? And what would you say to, I'm sure you have students or people you've spoken with that say effectively that kind of thing, right? Like, I haven't chosen to buy or to support any white supremacists, and therefore I'm not part of this issue. What is your response?
Absolutely, or even worse. I think that's totally right, and I appreciate the elaboration there, particularly, and even more so. Right? You could even say I didn't go purchase it, and I actually went to the protest. So it's not me. And so it's about doing sort of, I've been doing right after the election. I started with a colleague, Jennifer Suchlin, and also just alone doing these workshops, what I'm just calling Racism 101. And trying to reach out to communities beyond the academy to just talk about really what does racism mean. And that's where I think there's a real resistance even in our, in U.S. culture itself. So let neoliberalism go and just go back to the good old classical liberalism. We just haven't done a very good job as a white culture really reckoning with the founding violence of our culture, whether that's the chattel slave trade or colonialism. And so until we do that, then we're not going to get further on this conversation. Now we're going to get stuck exactly where you're saying. Like, well, I'm not that horrible racist over there, so I must not be racist. Back in the 90s, I used to talk about this as the difference between overt and covert racism. If you're not overtly racist, then you must not be racist. And so we started talking about what covert racism looks like. And we just need to continue that conversation about what it means to have covert racism be sort of one of the real machines that runs along silently in our cultures. So it's hard work, and it does involve serious conversation in a way that is difficult across ideologies right now because we're so deeply polarized.
Mm-hmm. And is there a way that you've seen to be effective in creating some kind of bridge in this really polarized time? As you said, conversation is a key aspect to acknowledge and to discuss certain forms of racism, particularly those that are not explicit and overt. But again, I'm just thinking about the resistance I can see in not having really spoken to overt racists and not having the ability to find and call out overt racist acts. What I will get if I talk about race sometimes is stuff like, why are you bringing up a history that no longer exists, and these kinds of things, like we're not living in those times anymore. We don't have slavery. Everybody is free. Everybody's free to make their own choices. You know, sort of perfect neoliberal a utopia in a sense. But is there a way to bridge that while not becoming this, in the eyes of your interlocutor, sort of stereotypical angry left-winger or something?
Yeah, well, that's it depends on the audience always, right? As teachers, we know that. It always depends on who we're talking with. I'm always, and I think it's cool, did become my trope, right? I'm always interested in aesthetics. And so I'm always interested in where can we find our common aesthetic? And if we can find, and for me, I like music a lot. I listen to music a lot. And so I have a decent range of music that I enjoy. And so if we can find music that we like, or if we can find some aesthetic thing that we're all enjoying, that can open up ways then to ask some questions, at least. To just say, do you know the history of this music? Or do you know where this particular, why is this particular song talking about prison? Or why is this particular song talking about, drinking beer? There's all kinds of ways to get further into these conversations. So that's one aspect, if you're asking a kind of 101, because I do think it's a fine common ground. Humor can do that a lot too. I think humor can go a long way in those things. But in terms of finally raising the unpopular question, right? I mean, Sarah Ahmed, a feminist with whom I'm sure you're familiar, calls herself and calls out the notion of being a feminist killjoy. And I don't take that lightly. And unfortunately, that's part of it, is to actually raise the uncomfortable question and let some anger surface as a part of these conversations, because it is going to make everybody uncomfortable. Nobody really does want to come out of their comfortable middle-class white lives and deal with the fact that they might be complicit in some manner. And those are big words. Those are big claims that we would want to temper carefully. But I don't think it does us any favors to avoid the more confrontational thing. So it's not an easy, the climate in which we're living, where people are going to spout kinds of dogmas from either end of the spectrum, is really a huge part of the problem here. And we all know that. The neoliberal spin is that you have a very polarized country, right, where the right wing is spouting dogma and the left wing is spouting dogma, and nobody's listening. The problem that neoliberalism pushes in there is that we've increasingly lost any kind of ability to hear anything else. So it's like, well, they're speaking in really loud voices. We better listen. Oh, okay, now that's over. Now let's just go back to our regular lives.
Yeah, I mean, it's a serious issue that is interesting because you're also dealing with something that I think at first reading could seem not very serious at all, like the idea of being cool, right? And cool, it seems superfluous as an idea. It seems like something that is, and I mean, I teach popular culture, right? So I'm always interested in how do you make people take something that isn't necessarily serious or doesn't come across as serious, to take it seriously, while on one level to show that it can still be a product that is sort of fun or that is engaging and doesn't, taking it seriously doesn't have to ruin it. But at the same time, how do you acknowledge that there are deeper implications? Is there a way that you approach cool, thinking about that kind of issue of, as soon as you say something is cool, it's not cool anymore, right? And you joke in the book that this chapter is not cool or whatever. But if we're going to take something like cool and to acknowledge that this is portrayed as cool in our culture and this is how it works and that kind of thing, it's difficult to talk about that without sort of stripping it of what makes it cool. So how do you approach that?
Yeah, well, there is sort of no way around being the nerd, is there? I mean, I think that we live in such a deeply anti-intellectual culture that it has to be, which is why teaching is the place where this can happen. And I think that's what the interludes were certainly with an eye towards teaching, so that we can bounce in and out of these conversations. Because the notion that you brought up, right, that we've become subjects of interest, and I try to do a lot with that in the book, to say that this is how we live, this is how we understand pleasure, is this constant stimulation, right? How many screens have we all been on already by 5 o'clock in the evening? We're a highly stimulated culture now. And so rather than say, oh, that's terrible, you should unplug and go to the library, that's not going to work. Nobody is going to listen to that. So instead, does it mean to say, well, all right, let's take a snapshot of what you're getting stimulated by. Okay, let's look at that. Well, what if we look at it from this direction? What do we think about then? And then you do that for a little while, and you run that analysis for a little while, and then you pop back out, right? And you say, okay, now where else are we? Like, where else did we see this thing, which is teaching? And you know this better than I do, I'm sure. So how to do that in conversations, I think it's quite possible. The problem is starting the conversation. The problem is, how do we find the desire to even trust each other enough to have the conversation? And I'm not the only one having that question, right? I mean, that's the damage of how divisive we've become across, well, arguably across this started with in the 80s. So I suppose there's a whole nother argument to be made here that the divisiveness of culture is part of neoliberalism as well. I haven't done that work, but it seems like important work to do.
Yeah, it does, and it seems like there's more that can be built on from what you've done and what others have done. I'm wondering. I mean, you're working in a very reflective field in terms of race and queer studies, where people and their positions in society are often a point of interest in the discussion. Is there something that you do or that you think about in terms of writing as a white woman about race that you're conscious of coming from that position?
Yeah, absolutely. Feminism is really the place I come from most. And what I mean by that, a deep understanding of if we come from places in a culture that hold the hegemonic or the dominant position of power, such as whiteness, then it is and I would call it an ethical obligation, to learn and educate and listen as much as possible to what non-white people, texts, authors, musicians, whomever, are producing. And so that's been the touchstone for me for a long time. And it's become even more so since I completed this book, so that now I'm attempting to write a book. I'm trained in European philosophy, and particularly in French philosophy, and in the canon of Western culture more broadly as an undergraduate. And so I'm trying now to write scholarship without using a European archive. And so trying to really write only predominantly, if not entirely, with scholars of color. And that's complicated, of course, but I don't think the complications are so intense that we shouldn't do it. And so there are many ways to decenter ourselves as white people in the world that are totally accessible to us, given the internet and given the wonder of, libraries and such, that doesn't involve bringing the violence of whiteness and its ability to constantly co-opt cultures of color, which is the heart of colonialism, without having to bring that into everyday interactions, such that you're tokenizing people of color and saying, well, what do you think? I'm interviewing you about your life because I want to understand race. That's not what I'm saying. So I think being very attentive to and doing a lot of education of ourselves. So I've done a lot of self-education around what whiteness is in the world from non-white perspectives. And that's something I've been teaching and reading about for years.
Mm-hmm. Have you found that in the years that you have been doing this, that any of your positions or your thinking has changed? And if so, in what way has your thinking changed on either writing or on representing different races in this discourse?
That's a difficult question. I mean, the writing and the representation question. Because there are core things that happen that change, right? I mean, you begin not to think of whiteness as benevolent. You begin not to think of whiteness as progressive. And you also, and for somebody trained in philosophy, it's pretty intense. You begin not to think of whiteness as rational, which is a pretty big one to let go of. But in terms of representation, I think I'm still working on that. I don't know that I feel like I've entirely sorted that out. There is always the danger of, which I've been accused of in this book, and I think it's probably legitimate, of tokenizing some scholars of color, that I use Hortense Spillers in this kind of tokenized way in the book. And I don't know if it's tokenized so much as I wasn't yet able to completely immerse myself in the amazing work of Hortense Spillers, which thankfully I've had that opportunity since. So the dangers of tokenizing are certainly a flag to be concerned about. And to put that more positively then is to engage whatever we are thinking about. So that for me with Cool, it was clearly Black aesthetics, and it was clearly Black masculine aesthetics, which is how I landed finally on the work of Kehinde Wiley as the concluding interlude. That if we're going to do that kind of work and we want to get interested in something Latinx aesthetics or whatever the particular culture might be, that we do that all the way down, that part of the phrase, and again, I cite Bell Hooks, because one of her ongoing mantras that I've heard time and again hearing her speak is, you got to do your homework, and you got to do your homework well, and you can't rely on other people to do your homework for you. Mm-hmm. So that's not necessarily about representation, because I think that's a difficult question you're asking. And if you want to go further with that, I need to hear more on what you have in mind.
Yeah, well, I think you've started to answer it well, and it's definitely not something that is going to be solved immediately or through some quick change in our habits or something like that. Sure. But that brings me, I guess, to one of my last questions for you, which is building on this book and the reading that you've been doing and the writing that you've been doing. How do you, as a scholar, and how do you think maybe more generally we as interested scholars in this kind of field can move forward in more ethical ways and continue pursuing this? Because, clearly the next book or the next article we read or whatever is not going to solve the issues that we're discussing today. But hopefully, I think we move forward, progress in some kind of way, not necessarily in some kind of teleology towards some perfect utopia, but at least to make a difference in a more positive way on a sort of ethical plane. What are you aiming for, and what do you think we ought to perhaps aim for more generally?
Well, I do still stand by the concluding chapter of the book, right? Which is ironically perhaps, but you can hear the music love in there titled Stop Making Sense. Because I do think there is a way in which our overarching rationalist epistemologies of the Western canon are not really that helpful to us right now, and may be part of the problem, right? This idea that if we could just sort it all out and rationally map it, which I do a lot of, right? I have a lot of crazy charts in the book, that then we'd know, and then it would be over. I think the work is going to be much more affective. And so in that regard, the cool question is still there, because I think we have to find ways to connect and to move our affects. One thing I'm thinking of in this next project is to try to really theorize and theorize isn't even really the right verb, but to give accounts of racism, beyond what I'm calling the cultural syntax of liberal sentimentality. So it's not just guilt and it's not just shame. It has to be to move us affectively into different registers, because there's a lot of pleasure there too in that violence. And that's not something we want to talk or think about. And then what else is out there, right? What other affects? Attentiveness to the affects of racism that aren't just in those old syntaxes. And the person I'm thinking with most there is Saidiya Hartman, who is just, brilliant at calling out the limits of liberal sentimentality in the racist worlds in which we live. So that's one aspect. The other is a real call and a real kind of grounding commitment that I'm not shaking off, and it's just getting more intense for me, which is the commitment that the erasure of ethics is tied directly to these problems of race and racism. And so as we move into a variety of kinds of topics or thinking that we, particularly as white scholars who are not in any way culturally or academically trained to do this, to consistently think, how is this, whatever it is, racialized? And to try to take up race in every nook and cranny of our lives and worlds so that we can really begin to feel it and the texture of it as it's pervading these worlds. So so thinking further about this twinned erasure of race and ethics that I end the book on, and that as largely a non-rational kind of phenomenon, seems to me still really important.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today. I mean, as you said, talking about this stuff is awkward. It's not something that we like, and that I think any of us, whatever work we're doing, get pleasure in it. In fact, probably quite the opposite, to think about the state of affairs today and the state of race and racism today. But at the same time, not acknowledging it, I think, is contributing to it, or would contribute to it. And so it's important work, and you've written a thoughtful book here, and I just wanted to say I appreciate you writing this, and I appreciate you sharing your time with me today.
Well, I really appreciate the conversation. It is difficult to talk about, and I really appreciate your thoughtfulness in putting this together, and just the interest in the book. So thanks for doing all the work you're doing too, and I look forward to being in touch.